All right, but let's get to the main event tonight, because we all know why we're here. We're here to see Dr. Lorri Glover, who's currently a professor in John Francis Bannon SG Endowed Chair at St. Louis University. She's taught at the University of Tennessee and Otterbein College. She earned her PhD from the University of Kentucky. She's the author and co-author of numerous books, prize-winning books included, but some of them included are Founders as Fathers, The Private Lives and Politics of American Revolutionaries. Some of you may have been lucky enough to be here when she spoke at one of the Michelle Smith lectures on that title, which is really an extraordinary book. She is currently a research fellow here in the library, so we bring all the best people in here. We try to indoctrinate them in the stories of George Washington. We learn from them, and Lorri has been particularly helpful in our Teacher Institute. She was here this summer with teachers. We bring teachers from all over the country here in the summer to help them teach the founding better, and to do that, they got to bring the best college professors in here to help them, and I really appreciate the help she's given us. So tonight, I hope you give her a big round of applause, and I promised her that this is the best audience in the country for the history of the founding era, and so you're prepared, you're ready to quiz her, and she's going to talk about which is a great book. I read it in one sitting, The Fate of the Revolution, Virginians Debate the Constitution. Dr. Lorri Glover.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Not too loud? So I am so grateful to Doug and everyone who made it possible for me to be at Mount Vernon. It is a splendid place to work. It's also a little nerve-wracking to speak here because those of you who've been here regularly know, like, the standard here is excellence. So when you show up at Mount Vernon, you have to bring your A game and plan on getting better because everyone around you is excellent. And it has been such a privilege to be here this week with three other fellows, Colin, David, and Betsy, and I look forward to coming back in December. And if it just couldn't be happy enough for me, then my beloved sweet friend Josh Mather came from Alexandria, and so if it goes badly tonight, I still know it'll be okay because Josh will take care of me tonight. Okay, so I'm going to make sure this works. And it does. But I don't want you to look at that yet. All right. So, in about 2.5 weeks, a handful of states will decide the future of our bitterly divided nation in an election that feels to many Americans less like an exercise in representative democracy and more like an existential crisis. The swing states are a moving target. So I wrote this talk some time ago, and at that point, it seemed like early on election night, New Hampshire and North Carolina, and maybe Virginia, would loom large. And then as the polls close in the central time zone, we'll pivot for sure to Florida and Ohio, and then later in the night to places like Colorado and Nevada. We'll be looking at those states with a mixture of hope and fear. If it brings you any comfort, and I'm sure that it won't, but just in case it does, it's not the first time that Americans have looked at some states with a mixture of hope and fear. Okay, that's good. Nope. There we go. So, in fact, our current distressing divisions are in some ways as old as the Constitution itself, and this is my favorite New Yorker cartoon, or one of my favorite New Yorker cartoons. Most Americans are unaware of the long gap between the proposal for the Constitution in September of 1787 and the addition of the Bill of Rights over 4 years later. In the greatest outpouring of public debate in all of American history, for nearly a year, citizens in all of the states interrogated the proposed redesign of America's government before narrowly accepting it in the summer of 1788. Then, only because of pressure exerted during those debates, did the first U.S. Congress propose 12 changes in 1789. And those revisions in turn went through their own long, divisive ratification process until finally 10 amendments were approved in December of 1791. Today, that crucial period is all but lost to us. The Bill of Rights and the Constitution are sewn together so seamlessly as to erase all division. Try this real carefully. Yeah, the trick is you have to wait for it. So, we reverently, I believe with armed guards there, watch over these documents, pulled out of time and history. No one who lived in late 18th century America would so easily glide over the hard years between 1787 and 1791. They would be shocked, in fact, by how casually we've forgotten the vicious debates over whether or not to ratify the highly controversial proposed Constitution. Even the principal architect of the Constitution and its most dedicated defender tried, without very much success I would add, to remind Americans of this fact. And so Madison famously said it's in the state conventions that life was breathed into the Constitution, not at the Philadelphia meeting. Far from the sanctified text we so carefully safeguard today, the Constitution was born out of angry debates that should feel familiar to present-day Americans, with partisans on each side, certain that they were the only honorable people, with an outcome so far from inevitable that it felt completely unpredictable, and with a sense of urgency that was palpable and a fear of loss that was pervasive. In our mind's eye and in our national mythology about the Constitution, this is how we see the creation of our government, right? But in point of fact, this is probably a little more accurate. That's a drawing from Congress in the 1790s, but it works transplanted back to the late 1780s as well. You can hear in the writings from people who lived through this time how afraid they were, how dangerous a situation the country seemed to be in. We are, cautioned Patrick Henry, wandering on the great ocean of human affairs. I see no landmark to guide us. We are running, we know not whither. Americans could talk of little else in 1787 and 88. The papers were filled with political news, family members fought about the Constitution over the dinner table, and every other public affairs issue was either subsumed by or filtered through the politics of the Constitution. Men made wild accusations about their opponents' deceitfulness, their self-interestedness, their ignorance. Both sides charged the other with fomenting civil unrest, if not outright committing treason. Each side was certain that the other was betraying the revolution, that their opponent's conduct was, as one man said, incompatible with and subversive of those virtuous plans established by our brave and worthy patriots of the late Revolution. Each side sure that their rivals' disloyalty would bring about, said another man, a total dissolution of our existence as a republic. Supporters of the Constitution quickly, if inaccurately, claimed the more flattering sounding name Federalist. And Federalists insisted that failing to ratify would incite a civil war, that grieving mothers would blame the narrow-minded critics of the plan for the loss of our slaughtered husbands, the rape of our daughters, and the mangled bodies of our sons. Critics of the proposed Constitution were given the unflattering but still sticky name Anti-Federalist by their better organized opponents, and those critics, or Anti-Federalist, matched the Federalists step for step. Under the dangerous power-mongering Constitution, they said, our sons will be pressed into the army, daughters will be ravished, that was another 18th century word for rape, and every species of personal insult and abuse will be offered at pleasure. One newspaper editor, looking on in fear and disgust, wondered, what will not wicked and unprincipled men do and say to effect their infernal purposes. Familiar. So, how did that generation descend so quickly and so far into such rancor and mutual contempt? Explaining the founding generation's perceptions of the Constitution is extraordinarily complex. Doug and I talked about this today on a podcast we did. It's very complex, which is why the theory of originalism is so hollow. What the founders meant originally by the Constitution varies wildly, depending on who you ask and when. If we use just Madison as a case, he doesn't think the Bill of Rights is important, and then he does think a Bill of Rights is important, and that's just Madison in about a 2-year period. Anyway, but despite that complexity, there is a helpful way of explaining the general division into two camps, supporters and critics of the Constitution, or Federalist and Anti-Federalist. And that is by thinking about perceptions of the Constitution in terms of the central political struggle of that age, which I would argue remains the central political struggle of our age. And that is balancing individual rights against public safety, or liberty against power. Too much individual liberty, and you fall into anarchy. Too much governmental power, and you fall prey to despotism. Federalists, generally speaking, were worried about social and economic instability fueling anarchy. Without some governmental powers to ensure public trust, that's not me, so otherwise I'm not worried. Without some governmental powers to ensure public trust and safety, there could be no individual liberty. And so they read the Constitution as a very measured remedy to the problems being sown by the deeply flawed Articles of Confederation. They saw a crying need for a Congress empowered to set economic policy for the whole country, for a Supreme Court to mediate disputes between the states, for a strong chief executive to negotiate with foreign leaders. Anti-Federalists, again generally speaking, worried that this move toward government-led stability would destroy liberty. Certainly they understood that the Articles needed to be revised and governmental power better balanced against individual liberty. But to their minds, the Constitution went entirely too far. Anti-Federalists took to heart the principal lesson of the American Revolution, which was distrust of distant, centralized authority. So they balked at the necessary and proper clause, which seemed to give Congress unchecked power, at the creation of a standing army, and at the absence of a Bill of Rights. The result was that as Federalists and Anti-Federalists debated the Constitution, they were often talking across rather than to one another. And then, like now, when people feel like they're not being heard, they start shouting. So this map captures both the long ratification process and the deep divisions among Americans over the Constitution. So it shows both the pace at which the Constitution was ratified with the debates, and then the color chart shows where the strongholds of federalism and anti-federalism were. Similar to our current shifting handful of swing states, the first generation of Americans understood that the fate of the Republic would ultimately turn on just a handful of states. And one state mattered more than all the others, and that was Virginia. Regardless of which other state ratified, it was widely understood across the states that without Virginia, the proposed Constitution was doomed. And there are multiple reasons why this is so. First, Virginia occupied about 1/5 of all the land in the United States at the time, and right in the middle of the Atlantic seaboard. It was the most populous state in the 1780s. 1 in 6 Americans lived in Virginia. And then, of course, there was the considerable weight of recent history. If the home of Patrick Henry, of Thomas Jefferson, and particularly of George Washington, was not in the United States, then what was the United States, and how could the United States in fact be? So on the vital constitutional question of that age, Virginians were deeply divided. Even though George Washington presided over the Philadelphia Convention that produced the Constitution and James Madison drafted the plan, the Virginia delegation in Philadelphia almost didn't support it. Edmund Randolph, the popular governor of the state, refused to sign, as did George Mason, who was the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And what went on in Philadelphia within the Virginia delegation was a reflection of larger patterns, so that the leaders of Virginia were about equally divided on the constitutional question, both in terms of numbers and talents, and the population was equally polarized. The result was a story that was incredibly audacious and compelling and important. A better story than a novelist could invent. So we must start that story by remembering that the Constitution that emerged out of Philadelphia in late September 1787 was a complete surprise to Americans and a complete violation of the narrow, explicit charge given to the men who created it. The U.S. government at the time, the Confederation Congress, had sanctioned the Philadelphia meeting expressly and solely for the purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. But that charge was quickly abandoned in Philadelphia, and the delegates met all summer in absolute secrecy. In late September, they arrived back in New York, where the Congress was meeting, and stunned the congressmen with their radically different, entirely new plan of government. And here's where the politics of ratification first began. 10 members of the Philadelphia Convention were also sitting members of the Confederation Congress. There were 33, I think, congressmen serving in a fall term of 87. So then 10 of them arrived back to debate the merits and the ethics of the plan that they had secretly created. Richard Henry Lee, who was representing Virginia in Congress and had declined for conflict of interest to go to the Philadelphia meeting, was appalled, but he wasn't surprised that the crew out of Philadelphia pushed through a divided Congress their plan. Lee said that Congress was manipulated into sending the Constitution to the states for an up or down vote to ratify or reject, as he put it, by a coalition of monarchy men, military men, aristocrats, and drones, whose noise and impotence exceeds all belief. So he was not happy. The next step after it wound its way out of the Congress was for each state to create a ratification convention. And that involved all manner of political intrigue as well, because each state determined the nature of representation within the convention, the parameters of the convention, its composition, and most importantly for the Virginia story, the timing of the convention. In Virginia, both Federalist and Anti-Federalist legislators thought that time was their best friend. Anti-Federalists really dominated the Virginia Assembly that year, and they believed, guided by Patrick Henry, that given enough time, citizens of Virginia would look past the seduction of a quick fix to the problems the country was facing, and look past their admiration for Federalists like George Washington and see the fatal flaws in the Constitution. If they studied it long enough, they would begin to understand what the Constitution actually said, not what the proponents of the Constitution claimed that it said or intended to do. Surely, they thought, with thorough study, Virginians would refuse to hand over so much of their state's power to the federal government. Surely. The Federalist minority in the Assembly also thought that time would work to their advantage. By putting off the decision until the following summer, they figured that many other states would have already concluded their conventions. and the weight of the outcome in those states might force the Virginians to ratify, even though they were very conflicted about and had grave reservations about the design. Being able to point to strong support from other key states, particularly Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York, might, they believed, move skeptics into their camp. And surely, they thought, surely time would reveal the narrow-minded, scattershot objections of the Anti-Federalist. So out of mutual calculation, not compromise, Federalist and Anti-Federalist legislators agreed to set the Virginia Ratification Convention for June 1788. Each side anticipating that by June, popular opinion would turn their way, surely, except both sides were wrong. The more time passed, the more Virginians dug in. Divisions were broadcast and inflamed by an active and sometimes a very activist press. Printers published everything from sophisticated analyses of the Constitution to unfounded and hateful gossip. Virginians read not only their own newspapers, there were 10 weeklies in Virginia in 87 and 88, but they read newspapers from other states as well, and editors shared information across state lines. Because of the singular importance of Virginia, reports, rumor, innuendo about Virginia crisscrossed the country. One New Yorker captured it. All eyes here are looking with hope and fear toward Virginia. Meanwhile, between October 1787 and May 1788, Virginians were consumed with debating the Constitution. As one Virginian put it, the plan of a government proposed to us affords matters for conversation to every rank of being, from the governor to the doorkeeper. Every corner resounds with politics, said another. So there are all these debates in the newspapers, in coffee shops, in taverns, in private homes, in personal letters that people exchanged, and in the Virginia legislature. All kinds of debates that preceded and shaped were really a rehearsal for the formal debates that took place in Richmond in June of 1788. During those long months of public debate, Virginia Anti-Federalists roughly coalesced around a conviction that the Constitution created their greatest fear, a distant, centralized, unaccountable government that dangerously resembled Great Britain. There was a standing army, and everyone, even James Madison knew that a standing army was antithetical to citizens' liberty and would surely unravel a republic. The federal government assumed the power to tax, which people found mind-boggling. In the states, citizens were used to annual elections and term limits, and here in this secret design of government, representatives served 2 years, senators 6, the chief executive 4, all with no term limits, allowing for lifetime appointments and inevitable corruption. And all of this without any guarantee of citizens' rights. Where they demanded was a Bill of Rights. Virginia Federalists countered that the Constitution was the only way to avoid foreign invasion or anarchy. Americans, they reminded the skeptics, were living in a dangerous world. The economy was in a free fall. The government could not pay its debts. The country commanded no respect abroad, and states were on the verge of devolving into separate regional confederacies. Shays's rebellion had just been put down in Massachusetts, but that seemed like a local and a temporary solution to a long-term national problem. So in March of 1788, with all of this churning throughout the state of Virginia, at their regular county court days, Virginians chose delegates to their state's ratification convention. The results of those rolling elections did not forecast an outcome of the convention. In some states you could tell by the delegate returns which way the vote was going to turn, but that was not the case in Virginia. In fact, the delegate roster predicted a deadlock in Richmond. As the opening session of the Richmond Convention neared, the only thing that Virginians agreed on was the stakes of the outcome. They lived in a really extraordinary age, but great numbers of the men who traveled to Richmond in June of 1788 thought that they were going to the single most important gathering of their entire lifetime. They would, they said, determine not the fate of an individual, but that of millions, not the welfare of the state, but that of mankind. And gathering at this unprecedented event was the largest cohort of the most experienced, talented, and now divided leaders of the whole Revolutionary age. On one side, the greatest orator of the age, Patrick Henry, George Mason, the author of Virginia's Constitution and Bill of Rights, the Revolutionary War hero and future President James Monroe. Patrick Henry made no bones about his reaction to the Constitution. "I despise and abhor it," he announced. George Mason repeated during the Richmond meeting what he'd said in Philadelphia, that he'd rather chop off his right hand than sign the Constitution. Now, James Monroe was more even-tempered than these two, but to be fair, pretty much everybody was more even-tempered than these two. But even James Monroe said, "This is a dangerous government, calculated to secure neither the interest nor the rights of our countrymen." On the other side was the greatest intellectual of the age, the man who designed the Constitution, James Madison, the highest-ranking jurist in Virginia, Edmund Pendleton, the war veteran and future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall. Madison insisted that the Constitution represented the only way forward, and voting against it would destroy the Union of States. "It gives me infinite pain," he said, "to reflect that all the earnest endeavors of the warmest friends of our country to introduce a system promotive of our happiness may be blasted by a rejection." Edmund Pendleton added that the Articles of Confederation are totally inadequate to the purpose of its institution. "Our commerce is decayed, our finances deranged, public and private credit destroyed." So just in that exchange between Monroe and Pendleton about people's rights versus the public credit and finance, you can see how people were talking across rather than to one another, and came to the meeting with a wildly different set of priorities. So another key player was Edmund Randolph, the savvy and popular governor who'd refused to support the Constitution in Philadelphia. By the March elections, he'd changed his mind. Federalists proclaimed him a reasoned moderate, but critics found him a craven egotist, consumed with popularity. At the meeting, George Mason took to calling him Young Arnold. And then there was, as always, George Washington. Washington was deeply important in the Richmond Convention, even though he wasn't even there. He declined to serve because he knew if the Constitution passed, he'd be the first president. And lobbying publicly for that kind of power was unseemly. If you want a snapshot of the differentness between that world and our own, there it is. That was a public image that Washington cast. He, behind the scenes, worked tirelessly, corresponding sometimes every other day with James Madison, and feeding news and strategies to a national network of Federalists. There were 170 men gathered in Richmond, 2 from each county and 1 from Williamsburg and 1 from Norfolk. That's the way the legislature was appointed at that time. Thankfully, we know what they said, because for the first time in Virginia history, for the first time in American history, an elective body allowed someone to transcribe the proceedings. And this is the frontispiece of David Robinson's transcript of the Virginia Convention. It was to be published as the debates unfolded so that citizens who couldn't get to Richmond could know as close as possible in real time what was happening. That decision, it was a controversial decision, but the ultimate decision to allow him to create the transcription was driven by a strong sense of duty to history. They wanted to create a record for us. They were consumed with the future, with the country that they were leaving later generations, with how we might judge them. So it's interesting to think about how often today we look back at that generation worried about how they might judge us. So we look back as they looked forward. The Richmond debates were as sophisticated as they were rancorous. Delegates worked through every clause and phrase, though not systematically, with interpretations they had polished over the prior 10 months to a high shield. The questioning was wide-ranging, nuanced, methodical, woven in almost on a daily basis with the repetition of wild accusations about men's wicked motives and the naked politicking for votes. The further the delegates went, the more contentious they got. It seemed clear to the hundreds of spectators who clamored for seats in the meeting hall that no major player was going to change his mind. The outcome would rest on a handful of uncommitted and wavering delegates. Seasoned politicians tried and failed to count votes. It was just too close to call. On Friday, June the 13th, 2 weeks in, Madison wrote Washington, "The issue of it is more doubtful than we apprehended when I last wrote. The majority on either side will be small, and at present the event is as ticklish as can be conceived." The Virginians deliberated another 2 weeks before they called the question. They voted on the afternoon of June 25th by roll call, alphabetically by county, and for the first time in Virginia history, they voted as individuals rather than in a county or a state-based delegation. When they got to Northumberland County, the vote was tied at 60. When Randolph County's delegates voted, the convention tied again at 69. So they got as far as the R's and 138 out of 170 votes. Still no decision. When the last vote was cast, the tally was 89 to 79 in favor of ratification. In the end, 8 delegates disregarded the clear wishes of their constituents, and 2 others just flat out ignored the express directions of their constituents in order to vote yes. 5 of those votes swung in the other direction, would have completely redirected the future of Virginia, and with it the future of the United States. Alexander Hamilton, believe it or not, has a part in this. News about Virginia ratifying flew out of Richmond, but only as fast as horses and riders could go. It's hard for us to imagine in our present information age a time when information traveled only as fast as human beings, but that's the way it worked in 88. Federalists were especially eager to get word to their allies in New York and New Hampshire because delegates there were also debating the Constitution in June. In fact, at the suggestion of Alexander Hamilton and with his coordination, Federalist leaders in those 3 states, Virginia, New Hampshire, and New York, had actually hired writers to stand at the ready to carry news of the outcome of the votes. Virginians believed on the evening of the 25th of June that theirs was the crucial 9th state to ratify, that they had moved the Constitution from a proposal to the law, but they were wrong. New Hampshire ratified the Constitution on the afternoon of June 21st. The president of the state's convention immediately, who's a Federalist, immediately wrote his friend Alexander Hamilton, and the writer they'd hired sped away. New Hampshire news arrived to Hamilton in Poughkeepsie, New York, where the New York Convention was meeting on June 24th. And at 2 o'clock in the morning on June 25th, in the early morning hours, a writer left Poughkeepsie bound for New York City to notify the Confederation Congress. Congress received that writer's information at noon on the 25th. So that when the Constitution technically became the law, Virginians had not quite started their roll call vote. Within an hour, yet another rider left New York City and headed south toward Virginia. He made Philadelphia on June 26th and Baltimore the next day, and as the delegates in Richmond concluded the last of their business and began to make their way home, that rider crossed the state lines into Virginia. Late at night, on June 27th, the rider from New York arrived in Alexandria, and there by chance he met another rider, the man who had left Richmond for New York. So that in the middle of the night, as the 27th turned into the 28th, these two men became the first to verify in the town of Alexandria that both Virginia and New Hampshire had ratified the Constitution. George Washington was in Alexandria that night. He had gone up to celebrate the news of Virginia's ratification at a popular tavern, and sometime that night, revelers at the tavern got the word that New Hampshire had ratified too. This flood of good news, Washington told a relative, gave, as you will readily conceive, abundant cause for rejoicing. The folks in Alexandria, Washington in particular, would have known that although New Hampshire technically made it official, Virginia made it real. When representatives of the largest and the most important state endorsed the Constitution, they gave Americans a new government and a fresh start. So what made the difference in that handful of votes for Virginia and for America? Well, first of all, there was the unshakable faith in George Washington. Many Virginians believed that the father of the country, the most beloved and trusted man in America, would smooth the path forward. My goodness, how terrible could the federal government be if Washington was going to be at the helm? And time eventually did work to the Federalist favor. If we return to our map, time was why Edmund Randolph said he changed his mind. So many other states had already ratified. Randolph claimed that he saw only two choices: ratify the Constitution or destroy the Republic. And other Virginians slowly, reluctantly agreed. But the thing that I think mattered most in Virginia was the promise of amendments. Consider what happened the day after the Federalist victory in the vote. Delegates did not go home, and they didn't yet send off their rider. Instead, the most adamant leaders on both sides stayed in Richmond to work together on amendments to send to the First Federal Congress. As it turned out, the decision in Philadelphia to not include a Bill of Rights, which was a short-term mistake because of the dissent it caused, turned out to be a long-term advantage because it gave the Federalists a point of negotiation, a way to sort of a fallback position for consolation. In remaining to work together with their defeated opponents, Federalists modeled the promises that they had made all month about how the new government would work. Many seemed eager to build a consensus to fulfill the Republican ideal of setting aside personal interest and reasoning together to achieve the common good, what 18th century Americans called virtue. And that idea of civic virtue was the cornerstone, is the cornerstone of any Republican government. Patrick Henry and George Mason were devastated at the vote, but they stayed on those days too, also embodying the founding generation's commitment to civic virtue. And their conduct seems to me even more important because it came in the wake of a painful defeat. Henry was more magnanimous and more virtuous than Mason. And he resolved, he said, to work within the bounds of law, to see the federal government change so as to be compatible with the safety, liberty, and happiness of the people. I'm disappointed, but I'll be a peaceful citizen. And that peaceful acceptance of defeat is so ingrained this I penciled in this morning, has been so ingrained for so long that it's really hard for us to imagine anything else happening. Almost hard to imagine. Forgotten when modern-day Americans look with reverence to the Bill of Rights is the fact that their most treasured liberties were controversial revisions forced by arch critics of the Constitution. Those critics were stalwart patriots, American heroes who loathed the Constitution, feared it, and in one case vowed to cut off his hand rather than support it. Forgotten, too, is the fact that the Bill of Rights pleased nearly nobody at the time. Both James Madison and Patrick Henry were fuming in the Richmond discussions. Madison convinced still that the recommended amendments were unnecessary and counterproductive, and Henry certain that they were just a ploy to undermine opposition. No wonder it took so long for the Bill of Rights to get ratified. And when it was, by the way, that sacrosanct, seemingly paramount First Amendment was only randomly first, because the states rejected two others. But that's a story, another story for another night. So this is the picture on the cover of my book. I picked it. It was created in 1988, a riff on a period painting to commemorate the 200th anniversary of ratification in Virginia. But I like it because it captures the divisions over the Constitution, even as it positions Mason and Henry. And Mason's the one that's holding on to Henry, who's the one trying to pull up the beleaguered man. But it positions them right alongside Madison, who's standing on the helm and slaying tyranny. It shows that they, and now we, are all in the boat together. This fall, we seem again, as Patrick Henry warned another fall so long ago, to be wandering onto the great ocean of human affairs, running we know not whither. Thankfully, the founding generation left for us an example of confronting our fears and peacefully, if begrudgingly, resolving our seemingly impossible disagreements. So there's a way. The question is, have we the will? Or more pointedly, have we the virtue? Next month we'll do what the Virginians did. After fierce debate, we'll vote to decide together the future of our American Republic. In the meantime, we might do well to look back at James Madison as he's looking forward toward us. In the course of the Richmond debates, pressed by predictions about the long-term potential for corruption embedded in the design of the Constitution, Madison proclaimed, "I go on this great Republican principle that the people will have virtue and intelligence to select leaders of virtue and wisdom." But he as quickly added that it was a fantasy to suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without virtue in the people.